Imagine walking into a calm, beautiful place beside West Lake in Hangzhou. You hear birds, you see trees moving gently in the wind, and everything feels peaceful. Then you step a little closer to a temple complex, and you suddenly notice something shocking. Two dark iron figures kneeling on the ground, heads lowered, frozen in shame. They are not kneeling in prayer, they are kneeling like criminals. And for hundreds of years, visitors have come here not only to pay respect to a hero, but also to show anger toward these kneeling figures, through insults, spitting near them, and sometimes even striking them. It sounds unbelievable, but once you hear the story behind it, you understand why this place became one of the most emotional historical sites in China. To understand the hatred behind those statues, you have to go back almost 1,000 years, to the time of the Song dynasty. The Song was one of the most culturally advanced periods in Chinese history. Cities were rich, trade was strong, art and poetry flourished, and inventions changed daily life. But while the Song were strong in culture and economy, they faced a dangerous problem: powerful enemies on their borders. In the north, a rising force, the Jurchen, who established what is known as the Qin dynasty, became a major threat. They weren't just raiding, they were expanding. They were taking land, pushing deeper, and defeating Song forces again and again. Then came a disaster that wounded the Song dynasty in the deepest way. The Qin forces captured the Song capital and took members of the imperial family. This moment was humiliating, and it shook the entire society. The Song court fled south and rebuilt a new government, known to historians as the Southern Song. They still had an emperor, they still had a functioning state, but something essential had changed. The North, which many people saw as the heart of their homeland, was lost. Millions of people remained under occupation. Families were separated. The feeling of national shame was heavy. Now, the Southern Song had a painful choice. They could continue fighting to recover the North, even though it would be expensive and risky. Or they could accept reality and try to survive through negotiation, even if it meant giving up the dream of taking the North back. This debate split the court and the public. Some people believed war was the only honorable path. Others believed peace was necessary to avoid complete collapse. And in the middle of this moral and political storm, a man rose who would become one of the most famous symbols of loyalty in Chinese memory: General Yue Fei. Yue Fei is remembered not as a prince or rich official, but as someone closer to ordinary people. His story, as it is told through history and legend, is the kind that makes people feel he is one of us. From a young age, he trained hard and developed a reputation for discipline, strength, and seriousness. He wasn't famous for being flashy, he was famous for being steady. In a time when the country needed hope, Yue Fei became a person the public could trust. When Yue Fei entered the military and began to fight, he quickly showed ability. But what truly made him loved was not only his battlefield talent, it was his image as a moral soldier. In many wars, armies harm civilians, stealing food, taking property, abusing people. Yue Fei became associated with strict rules that protected ordinary citizens. A famous saying often linked to him describes this spirit: that his troops would rather freeze than demolish people's homes, and rather starve than steal from the public. Whether every detail is perfectly historical or partly shaped by later storytelling, the idea is powerful. People remembered Yue Fei as a general who fought the enemy without turning into an enemy of his own people. As Yue Fei's victories increased, something important happened. The Southern Song, which had been pushed into a corner, began to feel hope again. People started to believe that maybe the North could be recovered. Maybe the shame could be erased. Maybe the Qin were not unstoppable. Yue Fei became a symbol of resistance and national pride. He didn't just fight battles, he carried the emotional dream of a wounded nation. But here's where the story turns dark. Because in history, the battlefield is not always where the most dangerous fight happens. Sometimes the real danger is inside the palace, in politics and fear. When a general becomes too popular, he becomes powerful in a way that makes officials nervous. A general with loyal troops and public support can look like a savior to the people, but he can look like a threat to politicians. Even if he has no desire to seize power, the fear can still grow. And fear in a court can be deadly. At that time, the Southern Song Emperor Gaozong and his officials faced a complicated reality. Continuing war against the Qin meant more suffering, more risk, and more uncertainty. Peace meant survival, but also humiliation. And Yue Fei's success made this choice harder because his victories encouraged the public to demand more war, more pushing north, more resistance. For leaders who wanted stability, this was a problem. For leaders who wanted peace, Yue Fei became an obstacle, not because he was failing, but because he was succeeding too much. Into this situation stepped a powerful political figure named Qin Hui. Qin Hui was not a soldier. He was a high-ranking court official who became chancellor, one of the most influential positions in the government. Qin Hui supported peace with the Qin. To his supporters, he was practical and realistic. They believed the Southern Song could not defeat the Qin fully, and that continuing the war would destroy the state. To his critics, Qin Hui represented weakness and betrayal. They believed he was willing to sacrifice national dignity and abandon the people in the north simply to keep power and comfort in the south. This is where the conflict between Yue Fei and Qin Hui becomes more than personal. It becomes symbolic. Yue Fei stood for the idea that the nation should fight for its lost lands and honor. Qin Hui stood for the idea that peace, even painful peace, was necessary. In a normal world, a country could debate this and decide. But the Southern Song court was not a calm debating room. It was a place of competing factions, secret fears, and power struggles. And in such a place, ideas do not stay as ideas, they become weapons. As the story is told, Yue Fei continued pushing north and gained ground. The dream of reclaiming lost territory started to feel real. And then something happened that became one of the most famous moments in the entire legend. Yue Fei was ordered to retreat, not because he lost, not because he was defeated, but because the emperor's command demanded it. Traditional accounts often describe this order as being delivered repeatedly, urgently, sometimes described through the image of 12 gold medals or repeated imperial messages. The specific details can vary depending on the source, but the meaning is consistent. The court forced Yue Fei to stop. Imagine being in Yue Fei's position. You are close to achieving what your country has dreamed about for years. Your soldiers are ready. The enemy is pressured. The people have hope. And then your own government pulls you back. A common reaction might be anger. Another general might ignore the order, claim necessity, and keep fighting. But Yue Fei was known for loyalty. He obeyed. He returned. And in that obedience, you can see why people admired him, because he placed duty above personal ambition. But that same loyalty also made him vulnerable, because once he returned, he was no longer protected by distance and battlefield momentum. He was now surrounded by court politics. Soon after, Yue Fei was arrested. And here the story becomes painful in a different way. It wasn't the enemy who captured him. It was his own side, his own government. The man who had been trying to save the country was now treated like a criminal within the country. The big question is, what was he accused of? How do you justify arresting a hero? Many retellings focus on the idea that charges were fabricated or vague. One famous phrase connected to this moment is often translated as something like, "It might have happened," suggesting the accusations were not based on solid evidence but on suspicion and political convenience. This phrase became a symbol of injustice in Chinese cultural memory. Whether the phrase was exactly used as later legends claim or not, the point is clear. People believed Yue Fei was condemned not through fair proof, but through political manipulation. In traditional storytelling, Qin Hui becomes the main villain behind Yue Fei's downfall. He is portrayed as the mastermind pushing the case forward, persuading the emperor, silencing opposition, and removing a dangerous figure to make peace possible. And Qin Hui's wife, Lady Wang, also becomes part of the story in popular tradition, sometimes described as supporting Qin Hui's actions or encouraging them. Historians may debate exactly how involved she was, but in public memory, she became linked to the betrayal, as if the pair represented a household of treachery. Yue Fei died in prison in 1142. Again, details vary among accounts, but the outcome is consistent. The general who carried the nation's hope was gone, not fallen in heroic battle, not killed by the enemy, but destroyed by internal politics. Shortly after, the South Song made peace with the Jin under terms that many people saw as humiliating. To the public, the story felt like a double wound. First, the hero died, and then the country accepted a weaker position. It was easy for anger to find a target. And once anger chooses a target, history turns into legend. Qin Hui's name became more than a name. It became a curse. He became the symbol of the kind of person people fear most during national crisis, someone who sits close to power, speaks of realism, but is believed to sacrifice justice and dignity for safety and political comfort. Years passed. Dynasties changed. The Southern Song itself eventually ended. But Yue Fei's image grew bigger. He became a symbol of loyalty, resistance, discipline, and sacrifice. People told stories about him, wrote poems, and taught his name as the image of a true patriot. And whenever a culture keeps retelling a story, it doesn't just remember facts, it shapes moral lessons. Yue Fei became the moral standard, Qin Hui became the moral warning. So when Yue Fei's tomb and memorial sites became important places for visitors, people didn't only want to honor Yue Fei, they also wanted to condemn the villain. It was not enough to build a monument to the hero. People wanted the traitor to be shamed publicly. And this desire created something unusual in the world of monuments, statues built not for worship, but for humiliation. At the Yue Fei Temple and tomb area in Hangzhou, craftsmen created iron statues of Qin Hui and Lady Wang kneeling in front of Yue Fei's resting place. Sometimes other figures are included in different versions, but the most famous image is the kneeling pair. The design choice is clear. They are not standing proudly like respected officials. They are not sitting like dignified elders. They are forced into a posture of submission, kneeling forever in front of the man they were blamed for destroying. This is the moment where history turns into ritual, because once the statues were placed there, visitors did not treat them like normal statues. They treated them like living symbols. People came, saw the kneeling figures, and felt anger rise in their chest. Not anger at iron, but anger at the injustice the iron represented. Over time, a tradition formed. People insulted the statues. Some spat near them, some slapped them, some hit them. Parents brought children and told them, "These are the traitors." The act became a lesson, passed from generation to generation, like a cultural memory you could touch. It's important to understand why this continued for so long. It wasn't just random cruelty. For many ordinary people, history often feels distant and powerless. You can't change what happened. You can't bring Yue Fei back. You can't punish Qin Hui in real life. But at this site, you could perform a symbolic punishment. You could release your anger in a safe and socially accepted way. You could say with your action, "We remember, we judge, we don't forgive." That's why the practice lasted. It was emotional, it was moral, it was simple. You didn't need to be educated to understand it. A child could see the kneeling posture and immediately understand shame. A visitor could see Yue Fei honored and see Qin Hui humiliated and understand the story without reading a long book. And the location makes it even more powerful. Hangzhou is famous for beauty. West Lake is known for calm water, gardens, and soft landscapes that inspired poets for centuries. So you have this contrast. Outside, peace and scenery. Inside, a story of betrayal and tragedy. That contrast makes the statues hit harder. People walk in relaxed and curious, and walk out thinking about loyalty, power, and injustice. Over the centuries, the site was rebuilt and renovated at different times, and the story became even more fixed in the public mind. Many people describe this tradition as lasting around 500 years or more, often pointing to the way later dynasties strengthened Yue Fei's status as a national hero and maintained the shame of Qin Hui. Whether you count the years exactly from one specific installation of statues or from the growth of the ritual itself, the core idea remains. This is not a modern internet trend. It is an old cultural memory, preserved in metal and repeated in human behavior. In modern times, things changed. Today, historical sites are protected, and damaging statues is often not allowed. You may see signs discouraging spitting or touching, and there is more emphasis on preservation and respectful tourism. But the emotional meaning is still present. Even if visitors don't physically strike the statues anymore, many still look at them with anger, take photos, and retell the story. The hatred has become quieter, but it hasn't disappeared. Now, if you step back and look at it honestly, you can also see that history is complex. Scholars debate how much Qin Hui personally controlled and how much responsibility belongs to the emperor and the whole political structure. Some historians argue that peace was a strategic choice the Southern Song felt forced to make, and that Yue Fei's fate cannot be blamed on one man alone. That is a reasonable point. Real history is rarely as simple as one pure hero and one pure villain. Courts are complicated, and decisions are shaped by many pressures: fear, power, survival, and uncertainty. But the reason the statues still matter is not only about courtroom-level historical proof. The statues represent cultural memory, how a society chooses to remember a story, and what moral lesson it wants to teach through that memory. In popular tradition, Yue Fei represents the highest form of loyalty, fighting for the nation, protecting the people, obeying authority even when it hurts him, and paying the ultimate price. Qin Hui represents the opposite: political manipulation, betrayal, comfort over dignity, and sacrifice of the hero for a deal. Once these symbols were established, they became stronger than the messy details. And that is why people reacted so strongly for so long. Because the story is not only about the Song dynasty, it's about something universal. What happens when a good person becomes inconvenient to those in power? What happens when political interests crush moral courage? What happens when a nation loses not because it lacked brave soldiers, but because it lacked justice inside its own leadership? That's the real reason those kneeling statues still capture attention today. They are not just statues. They are a public message carved into iron. We remember what betrayal looks like. And right beside them is the honor given to Yue Fei. We remember what loyalty looks like. So if you ever visit Hangzhou and you walk through that temple area, you'll notice the atmosphere shift as you approach the statues. People talk a little less, they stare a little more. Some laugh nervously because it feels strange. Some feel angry without even realizing why. Others feel sad because the story is tragic. A hero didn't fall to an enemy arrow, he fell to politics. That kind of tragedy stays in the human mind longer than a normal battlefield death. And when you see the statues kneeling forever, you understand the final meaning of the sight. Yue Fei may have been killed, but in cultural memory, he won. Qin Hui may have held power in his lifetime, but in cultural memory, he lost. The kneeling posture is history's revenge. It tells every visitor, power can end, but reputation can last longer than any empire. That is why for centuries, people came here to honor the general and shame the traitor. That is why the story survives. And that is why two iron figures, silent and unmoving, can still carry so much emotion, because they represent a question every society faces in every era. When the nation is in crisis, who will be remembered as the loyal one, and who will be remembered as the one who betrayed the hope of the people? When you leave West Lake, the mist and lanterns might fade behind you, but that image stays. Two figures kneeling forever, and one name remembered as loyalty itself. This story isn't only about ancient China. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't outside the borders, it's inside the palace. And even after 1,000 years, people still return to that temple for one reason: to remember who stood for the nation and who sold its hope. Now I want to ask you, if you were living in that time, would you choose war to reclaim honor or peace to save lives, even if it felt like surrender? Write your answer in the comments. If you enjoyed this kind of mysterious history, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because the next story will take us to another place where the past is still alive.